What do asset managers spend on technology? This is a question that we've been thinking about for a long time. Now, as a brief review, consider where we started. The initial question was, what do banks spend on technology? And that anchored the first piece of this 360-degree methodology that we're in the process of executing on. And when it came to banks, certainly the largest banks in the world that we modeled, even the Chinese banks, there was plenty of data available. I mean, even a Chinese bank will publish an annual report. Certainly the largest banks in the US and Europe and elsewhere had lots of regulatory filings and annual reports for us to lift out what we needed, including specifics around technology spending. But we knew going in to the next major piece, the buy side, asset managers, which in this case included both hedge funds and proprietary trading firms, since we wanted to capture the entire continuum of asset management, not just the traditional players, all the players. And we knew going in that capturing that broad a look at the asset management community was going to cause us to stumble over mostly private companies. And that was a sticking point. We couldn't observe technology spending patterns for private companies unless they were going to give it to us themselves. So one of the key discoveries that we made along the way, and I have to give a shout out to Ian Rayner for something that he wrote on his blog that made me start to think and made me realize that in the regulatory filings there was potentially enough data, enough of the right data points, unrelated to technology, but related to something else. And that led to the discovery that we weren't asking the right question in this case. It turns out that the right question in the case of the asset management world was, how do asset managers scale? And as we've been looking at these analytics that use headcount as the denominator, like tech spend per employee or revenue per employee, we experimented with a new analytic, assets under management per employee. And what we discovered in studying different kinds of companies, their assets under management per employee, we found a new pattern. And it turns out that the more automated the strategy, the lower this ratio of assets under management per employee was. And that made sense because the capacity of the higher turnover end of the spectrum doesn't require a lot of money to be profitable. And as we moved up the curve and as we looked at asset managers with more assets and more assets and more assets, we found that they had more employees, and this ratio grew. That when you get slower and slower and slower, as your turnover frequency goes down, as the number of transactions goes down, as the value of transactions goes up, as the nature of relative value changes to the point where you've got so much money under management, you can't hedge all that much. You can only diversify. You can only be long only at the other end of the spectrum. And as this ratio changed, we saw a new pattern. We called it the human capital leverage benchmark. Now, what's amazing about this discovery about how asset managers scale and the ratio of assets under management per employee and the shape of that curve, the human capital leverage benchmark, is the fact that it moves inversely with the technical leverage benchmark. And so we developed a hypothesis, and we looked at these curves and realized that maybe, just maybe, these patterns demonstrate the two and only engines of productivity for an asset manager. Now, I think this is true of banks and other financial services businesses. But this is the first place that we've been forced to look at it this way. And so we developed this hypothesis that, well, if we've only got two engines of productivity, one of them technology, one of them human capital, and they move roughly inversely to one another, that by knowing one, we could guess the other. Because together, they're an indication of how much automation is embedded in the workflows of a particular type of asset manager based on assets under management, which is a rough proxy for the kinds of strategies that they're likely to be using, assuming we don't already know that. So this hypothesis, this framework hypothesis, became the launch pad for the latest study that we've done. I want to tell you a little bit more about that study right now. So this episode of Alphacution Riffs will be released in concert with the publication of this study we've been talking about here, the context machine, a method to estimate asset manager technology spending. Now, oddly enough, I wanted to give you some context for the context machine, and that's this. In the past, when we were publishing a major study, which we've done for global banking and IT services and a few other pieces in between, we've essentially given that content away. And of course, as most of you know, we've been providing lots of insights into our work and methodologies on our feed, through social media, LinkedIn and Twitter, occasionally through some client channels and some distribution partner channels. And the strategy behind that was to prime the pump for some new language and new methods and concepts that are not necessarily ubiquitous among our audience. So we needed to prime that pump. But now that we've gotten to this point, focusing on the buy side, having detailed things to say about not only asset managers, but hedge funds and prop trading, based on, in my case, a nearly 30-year career in some pretty rare corners of the business with some extraordinarily intelligent people, what I think we've achieved here is quite valuable. And so as a result, I'm not giving it away. You can't have it. Now, that doesn't mean you can't get it. You're just going to have to buy it. And there will be details about how that happens, how that can be done through our newsletter. But I want to take this opportunity to make some broader statements about digital content. Now, there's a post out on the blog called In Support of Digital Content. I like to paraphrase some of my own thoughts about this idea here now. In this era, we who develop content live in a digital jungle. And because of such hyper-connectivity and the ability for so many people to publish their thoughts over the internet, it has become quite crowded. And people, all of us, myself included, have come to expect to be able to access a lot of information and a lot of data for free. Now, if I were running a charity, that would be fine. I'm not running a charity. As much as personally I'd like to be more charitable, this is a commercial venture. And I think that if I continue to give some of our best intelligence away, people will place a value of free on that intelligence. So I don't want to set the wrong example with this one. Now, I'll add a little teaser to what's in this report, because we start out with this hypothesis. We've gathered together a bunch of data on 158 asset managers, including 98 hedge funds, and a few prop shops and those who act like prop shops. And we've turned that into these curves, and we've turned this hypothesis into a map. And that map, which you can see a version of out on the post I recently did with Dr. Evil on the title image. That map actually includes every asset manager on the face of the planet, whether we've modeled them yet or not, whether their data is in there or not, because we think that we've captured the edges, the extremes. And so at the end of that report, there are a series of case studies, one of which is really quite unique. And that's taking some very famous companies and estimating their technology spending based on the framework and not based on any of their data. Now those companies include Citadel, Millennium, Point72, and Vanguard, where we've been able to estimate their technology spending based just on where we're able to fit them on that map. So that's a very cool case study. It's about a, it's a 50-page report and dozens of exhibits, so it's going to be well worth having it. Now, frankly, it's unusual to be this blunt about the exercise that's going on here. But I think it's more efficient. I need to be blunt. This is what you need to do. Now, that doesn't mean I'm not going to continue to publish pieces of insights on the feed and through social media and take calls. And certainly, most of the work that we're doing so far are the result of custom engagements. But in order to scale this so that the value of the development becomes more value and ultimately becomes transformational, this has to have an ongoing subscription service. And this kind of a purchase, this kind of a sale, a report, is the beginning of that, which I'll explain in more detail in the newsletter. One final comment. And I've said this before on the last episode, and it occurred to me it has never been my intent necessarily to put public service announcements at the end of a talk about technology. But it gets into what we're discovering more and more and how the human capital, you and me, are on the other side of this coin. We're the human capital. We have to figure out how to navigate the technology. And so for a broader audience, eventually, we'll have some things to say about the human capital side of this as well as the technology side of this. I think it makes sense because studying one gives us insights about the other. It's how the whole context machine works. So a thought to ponder as you consider this and other sources of intelligence. And that's the idea that energy will follow your attention. If you continue to place your attention on that which is not necessarily nourishing your needs, then that which is not necessarily nourishing your needs will continue to grow and thrive. But given that we've flattened the field where creators and entrepreneurs and visionaries can actually publish their thoughts through these new mechanisms, that it is an opportunity to consider new sources of intelligence. And as you move from placing your attention on that which may not be nourishing both your personal and professional needs, the things that you turn your attention to, the new sources of intelligence, the new sources of nourishment for your personal and professional needs, the energy will follow that attention. Now, as we adopt this kind of shifting, I'm going to trust that the right things are going to happen for Alphacution. So I'm going to bookmark it there. I want to thank you for your sliver of attention. I'm looking forward to sharing more of the cool stuff that we're doing here. I'm going to look forward to sharing another episode of Alphacution Riffs very soon. Thanks for watching.